inviting me to this very interesting workshop. I think I already found many synergies that we could probably use in the future. What I'm going to present now is about labor standards in regional trade agreements, or Region 1 regional is sometimes not the best way of calling them because they are not in the same region nowadays. But anyway, economic integration agreements, that most of them started with free trade as free trade agreements. The question is whether those agreements are actually improving labor conditions in developing countries, although what I'm going to present is still some general framework of how to actually answer the question, and I discovered many problems or difficulties in the way. So therefore, I hope to get some feedback, and I hope to come out with an answer in the near future. So I have chosen this sentence from the Article 23 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. I am an economist, so probably I don't know much about the law, the legal aspects of this, but I think this is a nice article, and part of it says everyone has the right to work, to free choice of employment, to just and favorable conditions of work, and to protection against unemployment. So those are some of the nice labor conditions that we could expect to have in all the countries in the world, but unfortunately this is not the case. So how can we improve these labor conditions? There have been different initiatives. One within the WTO. I won't enter into this one because it wasn't successful. And lately there were some attempts to introduce labor standards in actually the main body of the text of the agreements, of the free trade agreements or regional integration agreements. Then our question is, okay, is this inclusion of labor standards or labor provisions in trade agreements is going to have a positive effect on the labor conditions in developing countries? And as I said before, it's a difficult question, but a very important one for development economics and also from other perspectives, probably from the legal and the political science perspective. Then we have seen this picture already. Sophie had it as well, but I'm going to use it only to motivate the next one. So this one is for all regional trade agreements. It comes from the WTO, and we know also from the former presentation from Claire that we have more than 300 agreements in force, and we have seen this evolution over time. An increasing number of free trade agreements, some of them more comprehensive, others less comprehensive, and so on. But really, in the 90s and 2000s, this has been a very impressive increase in these numbers. Some of them include labor provisions. Then this picture is not very precise because I'm still working with the classification of let's say, agreements with and without labor provisions, because it depends on how you actually define what are labor provisions. So this comes from the same dataset from the WTO, and you can search using keywords how many agreements, let's say, include the words labor provision, labor standards, and if you want to be a bit more lax, then you can include human rights and things like this. But this one is only the most strict definition. So the agreement, the body of the agreement has to contain labor standards or labor provisions. And we can see starting in 1996, of course, there were some before. NAFTA also has a side agreement including labor provisions, but it's not in the main body. So it's not here, but I also consider NAFTA as an agreement with labor, let's say, provisions. And what we can see is that, we have more than 30 agreements in 2013. But if we use a more comprehensive definition, we can have even around 50 agreements. So this is still unclear what is the best to do, and then I would like to see what is happening for different definitions. But for now, let's say that I'm staying with the definition including group 1, 2, and 3, and I don't have much time, but mainly in the group 1, those are RTAs requiring for domestic labor laws to be consistent with the ILO guidelines. The second one is a bit more so urging members, so the wording is different. And the third mentioning, so all of them with the ILO, and the rest is more mentioning only human rights and so on. So I stay with the agreements that are in number 1, 2, and 3, and you can see that they are around 38 agreements. So the main aim is to explore from the economic perspective the impact of those agreements on a few labor conditions of pair of countries over the period 1980 to 2007. What I'm going to show you now is more in terms of harmonization of those labor conditions for countries that are in the same trade agreements. As a next step, I would like to see actually the conditions in developing countries and whether they have improved or not according to the number of agreements in which those countries are and the provisions, and so to go a bit more specific into the developing countries aspect. And by now, I'm going to use a number of techniques to solve the main problems that have been encountered in the related literature in economics. So I'm going to use matching techniques to isolate the effect of the membership in free trade agreements on the labor conditions, and I'm going to use instrumental variables to isolate the effects of differences in GDP per capita and also the trade effect on those labor conditions. So it's a bit sophisticated, it looks a bit sophisticated, but it's just to combine a number of methodologies that are available. And finally, I would use difference in difference techniques in combination with the others to, let's say, to come up with an effect that could be ideally interpreted as a causal effect. So, evidence, what we find is that the studies that are available, they find almost, I wrote weak evidence, but almost no effects whatsoever, showing that more globalization or more trade actually have a negative effect on those labor conditions that could be expected from the theoretical perspective. In terms of race to the bottom, which is a very important question, there are few studies actually linking this globalization with labor conditions, but there is even one showing that those conditions will improve if actually there is more globalization, but it's referred to the first wave of globalization. And another studies are more case studies, and they find actually no impact on the core labor standards. With respect to the effects of labor clauses in regional trade agreements, there is only one study, Kamata 2014, it's a working paper, in the US, Wisconsin-Madison University, and they actually made a big effort. Actually, the classification of trade agreements with labor standards, I took it from them, but they have many problems with the data they are using. So they take the data set for labor variables from the ILO, and they use earnings, working hours, fatal injury rate, and also the number of the ILO core conventions ratified. But the data set is very incomplete. They end up having only less than 200 observations for a cross-section of more than 150 countries over a period of 15 years. So actually they don't find, all the variables are not statistically significant. So if you want to interpret anything, it's really hard in their estimations. But anyway, they made a very important effort, because I think they were the first, to my knowledge, to try to do something, and they are also not really isolating this causality going from A to B or the other way around. What I'm going to do is to use a different data set. So it's a data set based more on labor standards than on other labor variables, and also data on labor protection indicators. I will go to the data later. So we try to cover these empirical gaps by trying to identify the effect and using the jure labor market regulation indicators, in particular minimum wages, unemployment benefits, and unemployment protection indicators. And this version is a very simplified version of the determinants of labor conditions. So mainly we are interested in the effects of the regional trade agreements, and we use dummy variables, as we have seen before in different papers, that take the value 1 if countries are involved in an agreement with labor provisions or they are not involved in any agreement, and we also define RTAs without labor provisions or no agreement whatsoever. So we also use openness, multilateral openness, so how open is a country with respect to the rest of the world, export plus imports over GDP, and also bilateral trade. So how much I'm trading, so country A is trading with country B, and other controls that we have to improve a bit, but by now it's only per capita, GDP, population, and land per capita. This is our first specification. I have a second one, but I don't have the time to present it. This one is in relative terms, the other one is in absolute terms. So in this one, what we are going to measure is convergence or divergence in labor conditions between countries belonging to the same trade agreement. And the target variables are going to be actually bilateral trade, multilateral openness in relative terms, and also this RTA variable. Then for this and this variable, we are using, for this and this one, we are using a gravity model of trade. We are estimating a gravity model of trade only using geographical determinants, and then we are taking from there the predicted trade in a first step estimation. In this case, we add for all trading partners. In this case, we just keep bilateral trade. For GDP, the same. For each one in the numerator and the denominator, we are estimating a growth equation. And well, I won't enter into the details because of the time constraint, but mainly like this, we want to isolate and to claim that there is causality going from those variables to the labor conditions. And then for the FTA, we are trying to use those matching techniques. So basically, we are taking for every single year all trade agreements that have been that entered into force in a given year. Maybe I go to the next. It's easier, yeah, to explain it here. So we are taking a propensity score approach, and we are estimating the probability of signing a trade agreement or a regional trade agreement as a function of a number of variables that have been used in the literature. So joint GDPs, distance between the trading partners, contiguity, common average. And we are actually using this propensity score to compare countries yearly, so year by year, those that have signed an agreement with those that haven't signed an agreement, and we do two different exercises. One for RTAs with labor provisions and another without labor provisions. And in each case, we compare those bilateral, so those pair of countries with the countries that don't have any agreement in this period. Then we put together all these, let's say, new sample of countries, that we call it a match sample, in which we have countries that are very similar in those characteristics. And then when we run the regressions, we can run the regressions for the whole sample or for the match sample. And if this is done properly and satisfying all these assumptions for validity, then we will be able to actually interpret the effect as causal. Okay, then again, this is the main model in which the y are going to be, so this is exactly this model, but without specifying this in ratios. So we can do this in two ways, using a difference in difference technique approach. If we consider the before and after, I would probably do this in a second step, because in some cases it's nice to differentiate between, let's say, the 2000, the before and after for some countries, for example, for EU agreements, including those provisions, for US agreements and so on. But by now, what I do is a panel data version of this, in which I try to mainly identify this effect. And the sources are here. This RTA, the main source is the WTO website, but in combination with a nice do file using data from this author, Jose de Souza, and then I use those variables, gravity variables from the CEPI, and other variables from the World Development Indicator, trade from UN Comtrade, and the labor conditions, which are the variables we want to actually explain, are from the IMF Fondazione Rodolfo De Benedetti, and this database is very comprehensive, and they claim that it's comparable, so you can actually assume that you can compare those indicators for different countries and over time, and it covers 1980 until 2007. So I think I have 1 minute, so I have to present the results. Hope to be able to do so. Then what do we find? Some labor outcomes actually converge for RTAs with labor provisions, and those are minimum wage and the gross replacement ratio, which is an employment benefit divided by the earnings in the last 2 years, the average of the earnings in the last 2 years. This is when we use the most sophisticated techniques in combination with the METs. Openness differences and increasing bilateral trade actually increase the gap in two indicators for this gross replacement ratio and for severance payment, but more bilateral trade cause convergence indeed in unemployment benefits. And convergence in GDP per capita is always indicating that labor standards will also converge for let's say, countries in the same trade agreement. And here, if you want to see the table, this is for the results on only using instrumental variables for the trade and the GDP variables, but not the matching. So here we have a higher number of observations, and actually we find this convergence for three indicators for labor, for regional trade agreements with labor provisions. Those without, we don't find convergence in these two indicators, minimum wage and unemployment benefits, but we do find it also in these two. But in this case, it's at a lower rate as in comparison with the regional agreements with labor provisions. And just to conclude, this is what happened with the matched sample for RTAs with labor provisions, and the convergence is also found in two cases, for minimum wages and for the gross replacement ratio. But still I have to refine the process of doing all this and to well, do some sensitivity analysis. So thank you very much, and this is the outcome that I have so far.